Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, Islamic thought, and logic, specifically Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, centering on Al-Farabi. Next talk will be on Avicenna, Ibn Sina, so I can have a short set of videos on Islamic logic before we go on to modern Europe and modern logic. So we're first going to talk a little bit about Al-Mamun and Al-Kindi, and then that will lead us, by teachers and patrons, to Al-Farabi. And I am of the opinion, I have to say, many people do not understand much about the history of Islamic thought or its place in the history of European thought and European logic, which is a crime of sorts, perhaps not internationally, in that there are no codes of such things, but perhaps we really ought to pay attention to all the interconnections of human history. So in 529 CE, the Roman Emperor Justinian closed Plato's Academy, which sent several prominent members to the royal court of Persia, not Europe, in the 500s. What is today Iran. Greek works, this is before Muhammad, by the way, takes Arabs and then later merges them with the Persians to create the Islamic Empire. Greek works were translated into Syrian, and then with Islam a century later, Arabic. This is the time when Pseudo-Dionysius, aka Fake Dennis, wrote his Neoplatonic Christian mysticism and angelology in Syrian, as a Syrian. A major source, I'm not sure what a chorse is, it's somewhat coarse, somewhat hoarse. A major source of Christian Platonism and philosophy, and this and other Platonic and Aristotelian works were increasingly brought to Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid dynasty. Fake Dennis, Dionysius, is fake because the original Dionysius was the first Christian bishop of Athens, and the later Syrian wrote under the same name, perhaps was thinking this was that guy's stuff, which is common at the time, a bit, and it was thought wrongly to be him, the earlier bishop of Athens. By the way, if you are a Christian who's into Greek thought, which is very much the vehicle by which Christianity and Europeans get, through the Abrahamic world, Greek thought, being the bishop of Athens would certainly put you in a position to be well-versed in Christianity and Greek philosophy. Dionysius argued, fake Dionysius, the Syrian, around the year 500 this side of Jesus, of course, argued positive and negative knowing, belief and doubt, cautophania and apophania, work back and forth dialectically to bring our consciousness into greater awareness, perspective, and light, in league with higher perspectives above ours. Debates about logic, grammar, law, theology, and philosophy between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Arabic were held in royal courts for centuries, from the time of Muhammad to the present day, but it was particularly in its golden age from 800 to 1200 CE, from Al-Kindi's discussions of the scientific experimental method to Averroes's extensive commentaries on Aristotle. The Greek word philosophia was translated into Arabic as falsafa, distinguished from kalam, theology, which also involves logic, argument, and debate. In fact, I've heard kalam is a word that sometimes applies to debate or argument, and then the most central of the debates and thinking would, of course, for Christians and Muslims and others, be physics and or theology, cosmology, how everything works or not, which is very theological. A bit monotheistic even, if you believe that. So Al-Mamun, who lived from 786 to 833. I have an image of him, I believe, sitting with Aristotle, who is darker in skin and wearing a strange kimono-looking getup, with both of them having holy halos of intelligence and head-like light coming from their heads, and a Chinese-style book, which Aristotle never would have owned, sitting between them on a book stand, which the books that fold in the middle come from China through the Islamic world to Europe. Al-Mamun, who lived in the late 700s, early 800s, was the most passionate caliph in supporting scholarship and science, creating an environment that encouraged free thought and debate like no other Islamic ruler, it is said. His father, Al-Rashid, had diplomatic ties with emperors of China and Charlemagne in Europe. He sent Charlemagne an elephant and an elaborate brass water clock. Now, anybody who knows me ranting on and on about Islam, I mentioned clockwork coming from gears and pistons, etc., from China. China through the Islamic world with dancing proto-small world automata, all the way through to the Swiss and clocks, etc. And that is a major route of technology, modernity, and a bunch of science through the world to ourselves, via history and others. In return, Charlemagne gave Al-Rashid what may have been the world's largest emerald. It's quite a gift. At the time, Baghdad was the largest city in the world. Charlemagne may or may not have known that, certainly knew it was contending. With a population of more than 1 million, far larger than Athens or Rome had ever been. Believe, major city, metropolitan areas nowadays are like 20, 30 million, so 20, 30 times the size of what was 1,000 years ago, perhaps. So the Grand Vizier, Jafar, featured in the 1001 Nights, as well as Aladdin, unfortunately, as the villain. In Aladdin, Jafar is the villain, was Mamun's personal tutor and instilled in him a lifelong love of knowledge and scholarship. Mamun mastered theology, history, poetry, mathematics, and philosophy while young, and was particularly gifted at kalam, dialectical debate and argument. Al-Mamun was a supporter of the Mutazilites. I mention them a lot. They are the rationalists of Islam who believe God has to be so reasonable God cannot contradict God's self, would not, as reason itself, make 2 and 3 equal to anything other than 5, ever. Just because, in a certain sense, telling God what God can't is impious, of course, and they would certainly get accused of that, but they would say, no, that's just the way it is, beyond our judgments, of course, is what they would say, trying not to be impious. If God is reasoning in mathematics itself, then it would simply, God would not, it, him, her, all of it, assuming no pronouns, would be reasonable, therefore non-contradictory, a la Aristotle and what we just covered. So, Al-Mamun founded the House of Wisdom, a center for study and inquiry which drew scholars and philosophers from all over his empire to Baghdad, becoming central to the Islamic Golden Age. Al-Kindi, who lived from 801 to 873, was the first major Islamic philosopher, a pioneer in the sciences, cryptography, and the experimental method. He was also one of the scholars that introduced Indian numerals and base 10 system of numerals to Islam, where it was developed along with other Indian as well as Greek ideas, the Indo-Arabic numerals, into algebra. Indians also, which I mentioned with India, would just leave thick dots where they didn't resolve numbers, which became variables, x, y, and z. Now, that would be seen as very strange to mathematicians at first if they did not have that. Why would you just not do that part of the math? You're supposed to, because it's a placeholder for later. That's not obvious, a tool, at first. That's where it comes to algebra via India, and thus into Islam, and then them taking all of that and making further developments. So Al-Kindi wrote numerous medical treatises, including the memorable page-turner Treatise on Diseases Caused by Phlegm. I haven't read it or turned its pages, but I do remember the title. Unlike Galileo and Newton, but like Einstein, Al-Kindi argued that time and space are relative, as all things save being itself, which would be big Mr. Being itself, are relative, subjective, and contingent, dependent on other things. I oftentimes mention to people, religion doesn't just do one thing or the other. Sometimes people seem to think religion teaches people there is objective truth. Other times people say, oh, religion holds people back by saying truth is simply subjective. We need to believe in science and objective truth. Well, all of these things do all of these things. You could learn there's a lot of subjectivity through the humanity, not only through the humanities, but the human side of science, anthropology, psychology. You can also go the other way with the spherical cow and physics, as they say. So with all of that, the Al-Kindi is a guy who is saying, no, there is objective truth and morality and all of that, but everything in our view, and that is not the view of God, is subjective, which, of course, would be that we are human, thou art mortal, So religion and science can't actually convince you of objective or subjective truth and all of that. They have, they do, they will. So modern scholar, I have a feeling Zerblat, when Zerblat replaces everything and is perfect, it will do that too, and may or may not be perfect thus. Modern scholarship often says that Al-Kindi merged Neoplatonism and Aristotle together, but he also, and this is less said and would be, unfortunately, not as said, he incorporated Persian Zoroastrianism and Indian logic as well, because how is he going to get a bunch of those Indian concepts? Even though Christians in Europe followed Islamic alchemy and astrology for centuries after Al-Kindi's death, he was an early voice against both alchemy and astrology. saying they were pseudosciences and the best method of knowledge is strict observation and experimentation. Now, of course, folks who were into alchemy and astrology believed they were doing observable things. They weren't just throwing things up in the air and saying, well, that's just what I'm going to believe now. They were, of course, observing the stars and chemical processes. A lot of alchemy became modern chemistry, as some of it didn't. And that is also stuff passing from China through the Islamic world plenty onto Europe and gathering many different things from many different places as well, as we're talking about. But early on, Al-Kindi said, I don't like so much of this astrology as well as alchemy, specifically trying to turn lead into gold or other things. I think that those are themselves trying to be sciences, but actually false pursuits, is what he said. Many people, of course, would see him as a forerunner of many people who have similar attitudes today. But I don't preach at people what entirely to believe. So, while ancient cultures observed the natural world and attempted to explain it, mechanical innovations from China, as well as developments in mathematics, allowed for experiments to be mechanically set up and recorded, extending beyond mere observation with experimentation. That is something that I often mention that I read in an early intro philosophy of science book, which has stuck with me considerably. I am somebody who is constantly trying to work out, well, if we're always human, and if we have been human with the same brains, then why are we logical or moral or not now, or how? A lot of people are convinced they're logical or moral because of science or religion. Then you ask them how, they don't know. They don't know how they are or aren't compared to the Hawaiians. Well, what happened, we do know that science is powerful. We don't see it giving human beings objective reasoning as opposed to aboriginals, though that is not something that anthropology and psychology argue. So, why is science so powerful if it is just all simply human like everything else? One of the powerful pieces of this puzzle is Aristotle would have been somebody who primarily observed nature because he did not have a lot of technology one would need, like microscopes, to observe at other levels. Well, in addition to being able to see things through microscopes, what was happening through the world before Europe had all the money and power beyond Islam is that people were, Muslims and others, like Galileo, setting up experimentations, which is using technology to set up trials and then observing. So in other words, people kept observing as science, scientia in the Latin, which is not a word Aristotle would have used. He just would have used the word craft to mean every sort of thing without distinguishing. Again, as I mentioned, there's a translation says, Aristotle says, science and craft, like boxing and wrestling. Which one's the science? I guess boxing. So with all of that, and I think the translator is fitting in science as well as craft for the English reader and later readers too. But oh no, Aristotle believed in science. It's not just craft, but he didn't literally say that because he wouldn't have. So with all of this, what's happening is Aristotle and Hawaiians observe the world, come up with thinking about the stars, hypotheses, suppositions, sposons. But Muslims, Chinese folks in the Middle Ages, and then between us and the Ancient of Times, and then ourselves, we can increasingly use technology, and we know how to, having seen others, to set up observable trials, which is still observation, but it's observation you're setting up technologically ahead of time, which we call experimentation. Now, obviously experimentation is also human, but notice that we have cultures that are powerful in experimentation, which would be the strength of a lot of the sciences. I do like to argue, thus, it's not that logic became scientific or the human mind. It is that the practices themselves become what we call modern science, which includes a lot of observation and human intelligence turning into setting up observation as experimentation. I do feel that point is important because you will still find people suggesting Muslims and Chinese folks had not yet discovered scientific logic and the scientific method, but then pay careful attention, you won't see them using examples, or rather they'll cherry pick something from the Islamic or Chinese world that's like we don't believe in, and then sort of talk as if, well, we all know we came to regular logic as another culture, when I have to say that is certainly not the case. And I mean, the social sciences do not tell us anything like that. Try to find it. You don't have to entirely believe them. Try to find it yourself. Come up with examples of how you are logical, unlike a Hawaiian or Al-Farabi. We're moving to him next here. So this is all a setup here, Al-Mamun Al-Kindi, to get to Al-Farabi, one of the central logicians in human history, one of the folks without whom we may not have Aristotle in our lives, would not possibly have Aquinas, who brings Europeans, Christians, aka white folk, Aristotle. Al-Farabi, the second teacher, as he was known, Abu Nasir Al-Farabi, who lived from 870 to 950, rounding out the dates, is known as the second teacher in Islamic philosophy. Who's the first, do you think? As he brought Aristotelian logic, that would make Aristotle unspoken wise the first teacher of logic, according to folks who call Aristotle the father of logic, the Abrahamic world again. The Indians and Chinese wouldn't. Into Islamic thought, and Al-Farabi made Aristotle central. Many people in Europe and the Islamic world were Neoplatonists, and they knew who Aristotle was through Plato. But it was Al-Farabi, and then in the 1100s, Aquinas, who many have heard of, more than Al-Farabi, even if they don't know much about Aquinas at all. I think Aquinas would be more often in spell check in many a platform. I can tell you that. You have no idea how much I have to right-click things in this age. You know? Telling you, every time I switch computers. Not with Aquinas, though. Good for that. So, we have history to do. Aristotelian logic became Aristotelian logic became Islamic, and Islamic logic became Aristotelian, debate, theological and not, with Al-Farabi. So this connects Boethius, who is the last Christian to do plenty of Aristotelian logic, as far as we record the patriarchs and major figures, who died around 525, to Abelard, who is the early, still medieval one could say, modern, proto-modern, not modern. Abelard died in 1141, who was the first French guy to do a lot of Islamic logic, and then Aquinas is around that time, in the 1100s. In France, passing Greek logic from Roman to medieval hands along with others, while Al-Kindi, who died in 866, and Al-Razi, who died in 925, brought Greek philosophy into Islamic thought. It is Al-Farabi, and following him Avicenna and Averroes, who focused on Aristotelian peripatetic logic, walkabouting logic, which still walks around in time and space unlike Boole and the Mad Tea Party, and what it can and cannot say. Now, Farabi was born in Farab, which is why his name is Farabi. He is essentially the Chicagoan. Conveniently, what is known today as Kazakhstan, northern lands of what was Persia, and his family was Turkish, from the lands Greeks and Persians fought over in Aristotle's time. After working as a gardener in Damascus, Syria, he moved to Baghdad, and he devoted himself to studying Arabic, which he didn't know, as he spoke Turkish, or what dialect that was, as well as all the logic and philosophy he could in Syriac and Arabic with the famous logician Abu Bishr Mata, who died in 911. I happen to like Mata, the painter, different Mata. And Ibn Haylan. Farabi was a great musician who wrote primary studies on music theory, and it is said that he once played for Al-Dawla, ruler of Aleppo, so well that he moved everyone to tears, then made them all laugh until they fell asleep, while Farabi then quietly left. He wrote many books on cosmology, politics, and logic, traveled, taught, and died in Damascus in 950, almost 650 years before Descartes. The first major modern European philosopher was born in France in 1594. There was a famous debate between Abu Bishr Mata, Farabi's teacher and leading logician of Baghdad, and leading logician of Baghdad, Al-Sarafi, a famed jurist and grammarian, in front of Vizier Ibn al-Furat in 932. Mata argued logic is a tool for judging right and wrong words. Sarafi said that it seems debate is a matter for grammarians and wondered what Greek logic could do to help guard a Turk, Indian, or Arab against speaking incorrectly. Notice this is somebody saying Greek stuff. Why would we be into Greek stuff? That's some other culture. I don't like it. It might not be so Islamic. Mata answered that logic grasps concepts that that underlie all languages. Chomsky would approve. I perhaps do. Such that grammar and culture are irrelevant to what is true or false in any and all languages. Islamic philosophers often mention that Islam includes many cultures together as one understanding and meaning. They believe, just like Christians see themselves as sort of the real Jewish people who really fulfilled the Judaism. Islam, and Christians are kind of unaware, Islam sees itself as the fulfillment of Judaism and Christianity and has built itself that way as for 1,000 years. So it is odd that Christianity then resurged, of course, but with Protestantism, not the Catholic Church. It wasn't just the Catholic Church came back. It's that Christianity had another resurgence, of course, in certain ways. Well, more than one, as cultures have. Plenty. And again, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, the largest systems of human thought in human history, the largest vehicles of science, religion, philosophy, art, everything, politics, what have you, without folks splitting so many hairs back in the day. So the Sufi poet Rumi similarly used the Jain metaphor of the blind man and the elephant in order to refer to Islam and God as the central elephant in the room and the cosmos. Al-Farabi's theory of certainty centers on perfect agreement, on the highest certainty in what can be known and is known to not possibly be otherwise. The very Aristotle non-contradiction. And now Aristotle's syllogisms. We covered the 4 perfect syllogisms of 1 or 4 forms, as one could say either way. If we use Aristotle's chains of reasoning correctly, we can provide certainty from certainty, not going from uncertain things to certainty, but from certain things to other certain things, which leaves problems still for Descartes and others who follow him, because he thinks, therefore, we all do. While most people are only capable of theology, Farabi argues, only the philosopher can learn the forms of complete agreement, which is participation with the perfect thought of God as far as us mortals can. There is a lot of Christian mysticism in which anything like science and logic would be referred to as human beings aspiring to their thought being like objectivity itself, which would be one's own thought as far as mortal can be, and people piously do not suggest exactly what they know, or couldn't. Here, yes. But that one's thought becomes godlike and thus becomes the structure of the universe, resembling it as far as we can itself, which would be being correct in one's teleological, physical, theological thinking. The master map, as Cornel West would have it. So Al-Farabi studied and commented on all the Organon, the logical works of Aristotle, and the Greek Neoplatonist commentaries of Plotinus and Porphyry on Aristotle as well. Many have said, if Christians are well, but Christians had logic earlier, yes, but without Muslim commentaries on the commentaries of the Christians, later Christians would not have logic of Aristotle clarified by the Islamic world, which was crucial. Some, the few who have read and studied his works, say Farabi's terms used in logic, al-azfa al-mustamala fil mantiq, and other introductory treatises on logic and commentaries on the Organon are unsurpassed until modern times, making more sense of Aristotle than anyone had so far, perhaps even Aristotle himself, if those are his notes as opposed to his students. Many Europeans have stated as such, those who actually cared about anything like Aristotle or logic. Farabi called his Platonism, with plenty of Aristotelianism, his foreign philosophy, al-hikmah al-majrikiya. I hope I'm pronouncing that at all correct. Often translated as Oriental philosophy, because of course that's other place is the Orient, which here would not work. Yes? A bit of anti-Orientalism almost, although just as bad opposite. As the word Oriental was used quite simply to mean foreign anything. In fact, in the 50s, you can see Egypt. It's not just East Asia that's Oriental. It's Egyptians, Africans, everyone's Orientals, which again means just not Occident, not white, And just blatantly, or just like, us and everyone else, just as them, it was, it's amusing. Again, logic, all or none divisions. Again, Carl Schmitt would say that's very much the concept of the state. You're in or you're out. And that's all the state fundamentally is for Carl Schmitt. If Carl Schmitt is anymore. He was somewhat of an in-out distinction himself, I'm sure. So, as logicians would know, he wasn't quite the set. Somewhat matching. So while grammarians, Farabi says, study the relationship between words, terms, and sentences, we just had the fallacies of Aristotle, the logicians study the relationship between concepts, ma'ani, thoughts, and meaning. I do enjoy the study of semantics, meaning, which is everything ever important to anybody, and can be dismissed as semantics. Mean what you say what you mean, form and content. Farabi argues that logic, mantik, is etymologically derived from the word for speech, nutq. I'm going to suppose he's right, and that ancient philosophers used inward speech to grasp mental concepts, the intelligible of things beyond their physical form, and outward speech to point to physical objects. Farabi argues being, mawjud, is most fundamental to logic as a category and term, as it applies to each of the other categories, something like true versus false, being versus non-being. If they are categories and exist, and it applies to things as well as what is true, what stands and exists, and being is the term closest to meaning, as he says, as I just paraphrased, to truth. more than any other word. Substance or stuff is jawhar, which Farabi says etymologically means jewel in Persian. I am not sure of his etymology, and I'm completely uncertain of Persian. Possibly because substance is the most precious and primary of the categories, again. What is and exists, and he argues Aristotle considered actual existing individual primary substances and universals secondary substances, possibly mental as opposed to physical. So what that would mean is that nice or hot or red would be, in a certain sense, strangely universal secondaries as opposed to the primary substances in which those qualities and quantities, etc., cohere and are manifest in. Farabi says that a definition, had, is a statement of the essential categories, while a description is a statement of accidental inessential differences, giving us the examples man is a rational animal, the famous statement of Aristotle, as an example of definition, and man is a laughing animal, sadly I have to say, it's time to laugh again, as an example of mere inessential description. Because we are the laughing animal, but that's not all that we are. Nietzsche says man is the only animal that laughs or needs to, likely mocking Aristotle and unfamiliar with Al-Farabi. Farabi says logic is a tool that produces certainty when used properly in all arts. This is again like Aristotle, crafts, arts, sciences. It's the same word for all of this. And in all the practical and theoretical sciences. Farabi argues, using and extending an example found in the Nyaya Sutra, that because he is influenced by the Indian work, that if we know a cloud always has rippling wind, and this wind causes the sound of thunder when clouds bump into each other, we can say, syllogistically, that the cloud causes the sound, and we can also, he adds, define thunder thus, as the sound made by rippling wind and clouds colliding, which is how it is cause created and so speciated. A nice Aristotelian term. A definition has two parts, he argues, genus and differendum for Aristotle. The larger group that the thing shares with other things and what can be said of it that is different from the other things of the same set. Notice defining it out both ways. As such, thunder is a type of sound, and to differentiate it from other sounds is specifically the sound made by rippling wind in clouds colliding. Nice, simple examples. He gives good examples in his reasoning. That is an A on the paper. Farabi gives the example of a circle, which can be defined as a figure with a line with all points equidistant from the center, which means, he strangely argues, that a line itself can't be a figure. If a figure is a larger group and a circle is a member of the set, and a certain sort of line is part of what differentiates members of the set from each other, then Farabi reasons that figure is the larger set, circle smaller, and lines incidental differences. This is odd, as reptiles can be four-footed, and so can mammals. But if all mammals and reptiles are not, then neither reptile nor four-footed is simply a larger group, but rather an intersecting set. And snakes have no feet. Humans have two, as Plato and Diogenes both knew while arguing over a somewhat plucked chicken, which may or may not be Plato. Venn diagrams are better at this than a tree of superior one differentiating into inferior many, I have to say, because I'm into pluralism rather than essentialism. It is also strangely similar, to Huishi's paradox that a four-sided figure is more than four-sided if it is a figure, as one side is contained by the lines but not a line itself. Say a four-sided figure is more than four sides, yes, because it is the figure and the space and the plane. Al-Farabi argued that thought, identified platonically with sight and imagination, is in the heart. Very also Chinese and Aristotle, which can imitate. It is unclear with Plato and Aristotle what role the head and heart entirely play in consciousness, and the totem pole gets a little wonky in weird ways where they're trying to work out a totem pole of sorts. I'll leave that, again, where it is. But many have thought consciousness is sort of in the chest and the heart, and others have said it's up here with the eyes where we see, and actually all of that back and forth in the ancient world. So Farabi goes with Aristotle as well as the Chinese here more. Farabi uses the example of imagining evil as symbolized by darkness, which is seeing darkness and feeling evil in the imagination, which is, he would understand, as the Chinese would, is imagination in the heart, which then rises up into the eyes somehow. Farabi calls genius overflow of imagination. He's very into the imagination, the heart and the mind. Farabi argues that poetry is good for improving the imagination, which is useful in all thinking and studied subjects. That's wonderful. But poetry can nobly direct the rational faculty to higher forms and moderate our emotions, or it can stimulate the baser emotions and pleasures, which leads to weakness of constitution and character. Farabi argues This is how Muhammad and other prophets teach and inspire humanity through images, metaphors, and analogies, as they have an overabundance of thought, imagination, and meaning that helps them see images others can feel. This is very much how Christian mystics talked. God has visions, says, let there be light. We have visions. Those are like lesser God-like visions that God uses to create, but we can't because we are lesser God-like but not God characters as mortals. So what this, as Christians would have understood it, God thinks, wow, it'd be great to have a Garden of Eden. Bang, there's a Garden of Eden. Now, at first, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They need anything, it's right there. Then they get thrown out of the garden and they have to toil. Now, in an interesting way, and this is how Muslims and Christians would understand it, you and I are like Adam and Eve. If we want to build a zebra, we have to go through the motions. As I like, Mystery Science Theater 3000, guys in front of the cat skeleton. Who am I kidding? I can't build a cat. We would have to toil. God can just be like that. And imagine something when it's very Barclay, for whom this town is misnamed. Mispronounced, at least. Perhaps not misnamed. We may as well name it that. I misspeak. If God imagines something, it is. If we imagine something, we also have to go through the physical act to make it, because we are not godlike and we're mortals. We're sort of half gods in this sense in the Abrahamic world. Many mystics thought that way, and theologians and others argued this as they're doing Platonism. So in fact, when Farabi is comparing the imagination to godlike powers and the most godlike of us, that's because the imagination is where we create like a god, but we then have to be disciplined and go through motions as mortals. So Farabi says, this is how Muhammad and other prophets, when you see prophecy and when you do science or when you do art, you are having God theophanies, as theophanies for Greek philosophers and for Christian mystics are God visions that you are having as creative visions. Nietzsche, who's not so much into monotheism, says that the highest value is creativity and having something like these godlike theophanies, knowing the ancient world. So Farabi says this is how Muhammad and prophets and everybody and scientists see the future, or see the present, or see anything with godlike imagination, which we mortal humans take part in. We have an overabundance of thought and image, imagination and meaning that helps us see images others can feel. Angered by dismissals of Aristotle and those who studied Greek works, Al-Farabi argued that logic was already found in reasoning, from the seen to the unseen in theology and law, which is a great argument. You can find philosophy and Islamic theology and law already, guys. We're already doing it. And could be used to further strengthen both. Great argument. Many Islamic philosophers argued, following Farabi, that philosophy and science are perfectly in accord with Islam to defend against charges of heresy. This is very much the Christian world. Buddhist schools do declare each other heretical in various ways, much as later European philosophers and scientists did. Again, and as I like to point out, if you think science solved all this in secular times, yeah, and how unscientific does everybody in the scientific world think if somebody else comes up with something that they have no clue how that could exist, whether or not it is? What you find is, of course, everybody declares others aren't in league with the true theophany and the vision of things until they realize that actually works, and then they carry over and carry water more, you know? That's how it works. A lot, all too often, or not, or stalls out. Many Christian scholars work to translate Farabi's Arabic works into logic and on logic, and Aristotle into Latin, which is how they would read it rather than Arabic, including Hermann the German. Haven't used that as a screen name yet. Who died in 1272, most sadly is not still around. Who actually worked and lived in Toledo, Spain, not Toledo, Ohio, as Hermann the German. And that is where we will stop, with Hermann. So we are going to move along to Avicenna and the unicorn, and how you can imagine a unicorn, even though there's real horses, real horns, but not real unicorns, but you can imagine one who is responding to Al-Farabi and others next. But we're going to break this talk off here at the half-hour plus mark. So hopefully you enjoyed that talk. Hopefully you can see how the ancient world and medieval Islamic and Christian worlds are actually full of thinking human beings, and then we now have empowered technologies and still are all too human. Much love, much happiness. I will follow this on a talk on Avicenna and the unicorn and imaginary examples, which follows this well. And again, I will see you, if I do indeed, in mind or life, ever see you.